14 musical cartoons from the 1930s that failed in theaters. When sound arrived in cinema, many studios believed that singing alone was enough to make people laugh. In the 1930s, dozens of musical cartoons flooded theaters, promised spectacle, and failed in front of audiences. Some exaggerated the musical numbers. Others smothered comedy with non-stop soundtracks. This video analyzes 14 musical cartoons from the 1930s that flopped in theaters, revealing how the hype around music accelerated creative downfalls, pushed viewers away, and turned sonic bets into forgotten lessons in the history of classic world animation that still resonate today. 1. The Merry Old Soul, 1933. Released in 1933 as part of the Silly Symphonies series, The Merry Old Soul bet everything on music, and lost precisely because of it. The short turns the nursery rhyme into an almost uninterrupted spectacle of singing, dancing, and movement, with very little room for real comedic construction. Every visual idea exists only to lead into another musical number, creating a sense of repetition that wore audiences out in theaters. The gags don't evolve, they restart. The rhythm never slows down, but it also never escalates. At the time, it was already becoming clear that synchronized sound alone was no longer enough. Audiences wanted jokes, not just organized noise. Even with competent animation and well-balanced black and white visuals, the cartoon was met with a lukewarm reception and was quickly replaced by more narrative-driven production. Over time, the short gained a reputation for being technical, not funny. That helped remove it from regular exhibition and from nostalgic memory. The Merry Old Soul failed not for lack of talent, but for confusing musicality with humor. It represents a common mistake of the 1930s, believing that singing loudly would hold an audience on its own. In theaters, it didn't, and the silence that followed confirmed that lesson.
In the land of make-believe, so runs the story. Mother Goose, she gave a party in the shoe.
2. King Neptune, 1932. Released in 1932 as part of the Silly Symphonies, King Neptune is a clear example of how the musical became a creative trap in 1930s theaters. The short leans into an operatic structure with characters practically singing from beginning to end, while comedy takes a backseat. The narrative, inspired by mythology, serves only as an excuse for extended vocal numbers, many of them too long to hold the interest of the average audience of the time. The central problem wasn't the animation, which is elegant, nor the music, which is technically sound. It was the imbalance. The songs don't advance the story or create memorable gags. They simply take up screen time. Historical accounts indicate the short received a cold reception, being considered slow and overly solemn for programs that expected quick laughs. It was soon set aside in favor of faster-paced cartoons. Over the years, King Neptune came to be remembered only as a technical curiosity, not as effective entertainment. Its theatrical failure symbolizes a common mistake of studios at the time, believing that musical grandeur could compensate for the absence of direct humor. The audience responded with disinterest, making it clear that even in the 1930s, singing well did not replace making people laugh. 3. The Mad Doctor, 1933. Released in 1933, The Mad Doctor leaned heavily into a mix of musical numbers, constant noise, and grotesque imagery, and ended up pushing audiences away rather than drawing them in. The short alternates between singing, exaggerated sound effects, and an insistent soundtrack, along with attempts at physical humor, but rarely lets any idea breathe. The music, instead of supporting the comedy, interrupts the rhythm and fragments the narrative. In theater screenings, this created a sense of tonal confusion. It wasn't scary enough to impress, nor funny enough to entertain. Reports from the time indicate the cartoon made part of the audience uncomfortable, especially when shown in family-oriented programs. The musical excess only intensified that rejection, turning the experience into something tiring. With a cold reception, the short quickly lost space in regular exhibition and was replaced by lighter, more straightforward productions. Over the years, it became remembered more for its strangeness than for its actual commercial failure, which masks its original status. The Mad Doctor failed not because it dared to be bold, but because it combined music and a macabre tone in an unbalanced way, confusing audiences who were looking for quick laughs in 1930s theaters. 4. When the Cat's Away. When the Cat's Away relied on the formula many studios believed was foolproof. Non-stop music from the first to the last minute. The cartoon revolves around mice who turn an empty house into a stage for a grand musical show, with singing, dancing, and improvised instruments. The problem appears quickly. The comedy gets stuck on a single concept, repeated exhaustively. Each musical sequence is built the same way, without real variation or surprise. In theaters, this resulted in fatigue. Audiences laughed at first but lost interest before the halfway point. The music doesn't sustain the humor long enough, and the gags don't evolve. Even with agile animation and good sound synchronization, the short was perceived as too noisy and not funny enough. Reports from the time indicate it didn't provoke strong reactions, positive or negative, just indifference, the worst scenario for theatrical exhibition. Before long, it vanished from regular programming. Over the years, it became just another example of the excesses of the early sound era. When The Cat's Away failed because it confused repetition with rhythm, it assumed that singing loudly and quickly would hold attention, but delivered a musical without comedic progression. In the 1930s, audiences learned quickly. Music supported the joke, but never replaced the joke. 5. Minnie's Yohoo, 1930. Turning a repetitive song into a narrative engine seemed like a good idea at the beginning of sound cinema, but Minnie's Yohoo quickly showed the limits of that strategy. The cartoon revolves almost entirely around a single musical number sung in chorus, reintroduced in different situations without significant change. Comedy becomes hostage to the melody. Gags appear but never get room to grow, because everything has to return to the refrain. In theater screenings, this created a monotonous experience, especially when shown alongside more aggressive and inventive cartoons. The audience started engaged and ended tired. Visually, the short is competent, but image and sound don't work together to create comedic escalation. The music doesn't evolve, it just reappears. Over the months, Minnie's Yohoo was quickly replaced by productions with more varied pacing, disappearing from regular programming. Years later, it came to be remembered only as an early curiosity of sound cinema. Its failure in theaters delivers a clear message. Repeating a song doesn't create humor through insistence. When music imposes itself over the joke, it doesn't sustain the laugh. It smothers it.
Sing this song for the old time.
6. One More Time, 1931. Among the many cartoons that bet everything on musical appeal, One More Time became a clear example of how sonic insistence could push audiences away. Released in 1931 by the Van Buren Studio, the short revolves around the obsessive repetition of a popular song, used as the basis for nearly all comedic situations. The initial idea works for a few minutes. After that, each new musical sequence starts to feel like a rerun of what's already been seen. The comedy doesn't evolve, it repeats. In theaters, this created a sense of stagnation, especially when the cartoon was shown alongside more dynamic productions from competitors. Visually, the short doesn't present major technical flaws, but it also doesn't offer anything that renews interest between one musical number and another. The problem was structural. The music dominates the rhythm so much that it prevents any gag from escalating. As a result, One More Time had limited circulation and quickly left theaters. Rarely cited in retrospectives, it became marked as a product of a phase in which studios believed that repeating a song was enough to hold attention. The cold response from audiences showed otherwise. The short's failure reinforced an uncomfortable lesson of the 1930s. Music without narrative progression only amplifies boredom, not laughter. 7. Let's Sing with Popeye, 1935. The promise seemed irresistible. Combine a popular character with a fully musical format. Let's Sing with Popeye, released in 1935 by Fleischer Studios, turned almost the entire projection into a direct invitation for the audience to sing along. The problem is that this eliminated the main engine of comedy. Instead of gags, there were instructions. Instead of surprise, repetition. The cartoon constantly pauses its narrative to display lyrics on the screen, breaking any comedic rhythm that might be forming. In theaters, this idea worked as a curiosity for a few seconds, but soon became tiring. The viewer stopped laughing and simply followed the refrains. Visually, the animation is functional but subordinated to the rigid musical format. Popeye, known for fast physical timing, becomes stiff within the structure of collective singing. Reports from the time indicate the short received a weaker reception than other titles featuring the character, quickly disappearing from regular programming. Over time, it came to be remembered more as a strange experiment than as entertainment. Let's Sing with Popeye failed by confusing participation with fun. By trying to turn the audience into a choir, it forgot to do what cartoons in the 1930s needed to do: deliver quick laughs, rhythm, and constant surprise on the screen, not outside of it.
I'm strong to the finish, 'cause I eat my spinach. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
8. Old King Cole, 1933. The idea seemed too safe to fail, and perhaps that's why it did. Old King Cole turned a popular rhyme into a continuous musical spectacle, betting that familiarity would guarantee immediate success. Released in 1933 by Disney, the short leaves almost no room for comedic development outside the central song. Everything revolves around singing, collective dancing, and repeating the same melodic theme with minimal variation. In theaters, this structure quickly revealed its problem: predictability. The audience knew exactly what was coming next, and the laughter faded before the halfway point. The gags don't surprise, they just illustrate the music. Even with refined animation and good sound synchronization, the cartoon felt more like a technical demonstration than living comedy. Reports indicate a lukewarm reception, especially when compared to less musical productions shown in the same period. Shortly afterward, Old King Cole was pulled from regular programming and replaced by cartoons with a more narrative structure. Over the years, it became remembered only as a catalog curiosity. The short's failure makes clear a recurring mistake of the 1930s, turning a familiar song into the entire structure of the film. Without real comedic escalation, the music doesn't sustain laughter. In theaters, it sustained only polite boredom, not applause.
Peter, Peter, pumpkin eater, had a wife and couldn't keep her.
9. Moonlight for Two, 1935. Few cartoons illustrate audience fatigue with musicals as well as Moonlight for Two. The short was released in 1935 by the Van Buren Studio, at a time when exhibitors were already beginning to complain about sound saturation in their programs. Here, almost the entire narrative is built around romantic duets, constant background music, and choreographed dancing, while comedy is relegated to small, decorative intervals. The music doesn't create jokes. It occupies the space where they should be. Gags appear in isolation, without continuity or escalation, interrupted by more slow refrains. In theaters, this resulted in a clear disconnect with the audience, especially in programs that demanded fast pacing. The cartoon wasn't rejected with boos, but with something worse: apathy. Before long, it stopped being shown regularly. Visually, nothing stands out enough to compensate for the structural imbalance. The studio insisted on long musical numbers as a differentiator, precisely when the audience was already showing signs of fatigue. With the shortening of Van Buren's lifespan, Moonlight for Two never received historical repositioning and faded away. Its failure highlights a recurring mistake of the decade: confusing musical softness with comedic entertainment. In the 1930s, those who didn't make people laugh quickly simply lost screen space.
Oh, the air is full of woolly and the lane is definitely
10. The China Shop, 1934. The mistake of the China Shop wasn't a lack of effort, but excessive confidence in music as a narrative crutch. Released in 1934 by Columbia Pictures, the cartoon is set entirely in a porcelain shop that comes to life after closing, turning every object into a singer, dancer, or musician. At first, the concept visually charms. Within minutes, it saturates. The soundtrack invades every scene, leaving very little room for independent visual gags. Every action seems to exist only to justify another musical segment. In theaters, this broke the impact. Audiences laughed at the initial idea and then entered a waiting mode, anticipating the next song instead of the next joke. The structure doesn't escalate, it circles. Visually, the short is competent, but the repetition of choreographed movements without narrative variation creates a sense of stagnation. Programming reports indicate a short run in theaters and quick replacement by more dynamic cartoons. Over the years, the China Shop survived only as a technical curiosity, not as a public success. Its failure reflects a common problem of the time, believing that continuous musicality equaled continuous entertainment. In the 1930s, audiences were already beginning to show they wanted progressive laughter, not just well-synchronized sound. 11. Gold Diggers of 49, 1935. On the night Gold Diggers of 49 shared a program with other shorts, it was the kind of cartoon that made viewers shift in their seats waiting for it to end. Released in 1935 by Warner Brothers, the cartoon tried to capture the success of big Hollywood musicals of the time, but applied it too literally to animation. Almost everything becomes a pretext for collective singing, with long melodies and repeated refrains that interrupt any chance of comedic rhythm. The narrative about the gold rush exists only as a loose backdrop, never as a driver of jokes. In theaters, the musical excess diluted the visual impact. When a potentially funny gag appeared, it was quickly swallowed by another sung number. The audience didn't react with open rejection, just with progressive inattention. Visually, the cartoon is competent but generic, without strong images to compensate for the sonic wear. Warner quickly realized that this type of heavy musical didn't work well in animated shorts and aggressively changed direction in the following years. As a result, Gold Diggers of '49 had a short life in theaters and was quickly abandoned. Its failure didn't come from a lack of obvious humor, but from a poor format choice. Instead of accelerating the comedy, the music dragged it. And in the 1930s, those who dragged lost their audience. 12. Mother Goose Goes Hollywood, 1938. Rather than trying to please the general audience, Mother Goose Goes Hollywood seemed more interested in talking to those who were already tired of movie musicals. The cartoon spends much of its time making direct references to stars and films of the era, using sung parody as its main resource. For much of the audience, this created distance rather than laughter. Released in 1938 by Warner Brothers, the short leaned on musical numbers full of inside jokes, requiring constant cultural recognition to work. In theaters, this choice had a clear side effect. Those who didn't catch the references saw only a long sequence of extended songs, without a universal gag strong enough to sustain interest. The music dominates the structure but doesn't lead a clear narrative, just strings together illusions. Visually, the cartoon is rich but overly busy, almost competing with its own sound. Exhibition reports indicate irregular reception, with strong reactions in some screenings and complete apathy in others. This limited its circulation and shortened its time in theaters. Over time, Mother Goose Goes Hollywood became material for analysis, not entertainment. Its failure in theaters didn't come from incompetence, but from excessive exclusivity. It bet on an audience that was too specific for a format that needed to be immediate. In a 1930s animated musical, demanding context was the shortest path to losing the crowd.
Where's that boy?
Oh, what boy?
13. The Sunshine Makers, 1935. Everything in The Sunshine Makers seems too optimistic to work as a cinematic musical. The cartoon insists on constant joy, sung voices, and repeated refrains, creating an experience that never slows down and never surprises. The result was curious. Instead of energizing the audience, the excess of positivity ended up numbing their reaction. Released in 1935 by Fleischer Studios, the short bet on a direct musical message, with characters literally manufacturing happiness to the sound of insistent songs. Visual comedy exists, but it is subordinated to the moralizing tone and the non-stop soundtrack. In theaters, this produced a strange effect. The audience understood the proposal quickly, and from that point on, had little left to discover. The gags don't escalate, they just reinforce the same central idea, always wrapped in the same sonic energy. Visually, the cartoon is creative and well animated, but the way music dominates everything reduces comedic impact. Regular screenings were brief, and the cartoon ended up being eclipsed by more chaotic and unpredictable titles from the studio. Over time, it came to be remembered more as a conceptual curiosity than as a public success. Its failure in theaters shows how even good musical intentions could fall flat, when laughter was treated as an automatic consequence of sonic euphoria. In animation, constant enthusiasm rarely replaces real comedic progression. 14. Musicland, 1935. Arriving too early can be just as risky. Musicland emerged at a time when Disney still believed that music could serve as the absolute backbone of animated storytelling. Released in 1935 as part of the Silly Symphonies series, the short builds an entire world out of personified musical instruments divided into two rival kingdoms, one of classical melodies and the other of jazz. The concept is ambitious from the very first second. Everything sings, everything moves in rhythm, everything exists to reinforce the idea that sound and image are one and the same. The problem appears right there. The structure depends so heavily on music that comedy becomes a consequence, not the driving force. The gags are present, but they often function as bridges between one musical number and the next, rather than growing on their own. For audiences at the time, the premise was immediately clear: two worlds, two styles, an inevitable conflict. After that, the short begins to repeat itself through variations of the same theme. Visually, Musicland is impressive. The animation is fluid, the backgrounds are detailed, and the personification of the instruments is creative enough to sustain interest for several minutes. But the visual spectacle doesn't fully make up for the narrative predictability. Every confrontation, every chase, and every reconciliation feels announced before it even happens. In theaters, it wasn't a loud failure, but it didn't become a lasting highlight either. It was remembered more for its idea than for its jokes. Over time, it became a clear example of the phase in which Disney was testing the limits of the animated musical as a dominant format. Musicland didn't fail because of a lack of talent or technical skill. It faltered because it trusted too much that harmony and concept could replace comedic progression. By the 1930s, audiences were already beginning to realize that rhythm could enchant, but only humor could make a cartoon truly memorable.